Good afternoon, Metatopia. I am Avonelle Wing, and I am here with Spider Perry. We are here to talk about game design that centers queer people. I am part of Double Exposure. I'm part of the team running Metatopia. I also do community organization and support for the Double Exposure community. I am a queer woman, my cis woman. My pronouns are she and her, and Spider will introduce themselves.
I am Spider B. Perry, and I am the owner of Nerdy Kepi. I do a lot of queer design for clothing, but in this guise, I'm here as an RPG writer. I've written for Onyx Path, Green Ronin, quite a number of companies, and done some consulting. My most recent piece of consulting that I'm very excited about was doing inclusion consulting on Coyote and Crow. I am a trans non-binary butch lesbian, and my pronouns are he, him, or he, they. Oh, goodness, maybe I changed myself. I don't know. He, they.
Cons have a tendency to reveal that stuff, right?
Who knows? But yeah, he, they.
Great. Thank you, Spider. I really appreciate you joining us. I'm going to start by laying some ground rules for the conversation today. We are not going to argue about whether or not we should be designing to center queer stories. Of course, we should. We're not going to argue over the merits of queer content. And if corners of the internet that have an issue with centering queer stories wander into the chat and want to but what if or devil's advocate, you will be removed from the chat. I'm not putting up with any shit because this is my lived reality, and you have plenty of space in the straight world to find yourself. Queer people don't, and so we're just not going there. And I'm pretty sure Spider agrees with me on that wholeheartedly.
I do. I'd like to add in a third, please, is that we're not going to argue over who is or isn't queer. If
Nope.
someone says I am pushed against for my experience of sexuality, romantic life, all of that, fine. If you're with us, then that's what I'm concerned with. And I'm not interested in slicing or dicing who is or isn't queer or LGBTQ. That is beyond anti-productive, and I'm not interested in it.
Absolutely. Um, so I do want to take a minute and explain why it matters that we design for centering queer people. And some of it is because there are parts of the world where it is literally still illegal and you can be legally murdered for not being straight and heteronormative. So there, not only is it a thing that you have no control over, but it is a thing you can be murdered for. Uh, Go ahead, Spider.
I was going to say
You
that
look like you had a thing.
well, we talk about, there are places in the world where you can legally be murdered for it. I need to make it clear that that's the United States. So, like, because the trans
Yes.
panic defense exists in, I think there's only 3 states it's not legally allowed in. So when we talk about this, I want people to not think this is somewhere else. This is here. It is legal in most states in the United States to fire someone, to kick them out of their house. The trans panic defense exists. The United States and Europe are hostile. So I don't want us to sit here and think, well, elsewhere, but here we're okay, and because that's not the case. So I just want to
No,
lay that as a ground rule that we're not othering. We're
that's not
talking
the case.
about other places. We're talking about here.
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
The other reason that centering, not including queer friendly content, not including queer coded content, not including queer subtext, centering queer stories is important because we don't see ourselves in media. There's been a lot of discourse on Twitch and in various other corners of the internet this week alone about how nice it would be if there was non-binary representation where the person was a human, not a robot, not a machine, not an alien, but a human being person. Those stories are incredibly rare, and honestly, I made the mistake of tiptoeing out onto Reddit to see what they had to say about RPGs with queer content, and so so I'm coming into this a little worked up about how shitty the world is, and that's why some of the ground rules, because there was a lot of concern trolling and other bullshit in that thread on Reddit.
Yep. Yeah, and I've seen it's been a very disappointing conversation with people who, and I think I want to actually start there as a jumping off point because that's a great one.
Sure.
Um, I have seen people who, from this community talking about that particular topic in ways that have, to be honest, disappointed me. It's awesome that there are people who find joy and representation and happy fun times in being represented by robots and aliens and other non-human entities, right? And I would never want to dim the shine of anyone who finds joy in that. The conversation here is it would be nice to see human representation and more human representation of non-binary and gender fluid and other, third gender individuals, and to see that properly built in, where human beings
Mhm.
are centered as a non-binary experience. Um, this is not taking away anything from someone who finds, Janet from The Good Place to be very relatable because she isn't human, right? And I would also
Right.
like to extend that further and say that another thing that it would be really nice to see non-robot, non-alien, representation is for asexual and aromantic people, because they are very often, cast and painted with the same brush, where you're not represented by humans. So there's definitely a lot of solidarity to be had with those 2 categories. And when we see, non-binary representation, it is so singular and so powerful. I'm so curious as to why anyone would not want to have that. I mean, I am 44 years old and I sobbed for 10 minutes when Adira changed her pronouns on Discover their pronouns on Discovery, right? When that happened and it was so simply accepted, yes, that was Davos knocking down my light.
Yep.
When that was so simply accepted, I just sobbed, and I wonder why someone would want to
Right.
deny that experience to someone else. So, um, but really, I wanna underline that nobody's saying you can't have robots. It'd just be really nice if there were some people in there too. So
Yep. Um, so interestingly, I just posted a YouTube video that is a feminist cartoon that is a machine is spitting out ice cream thingies, and there's a male coded character standing there with his ice cream cone, and someone comes along who's coded female and or woman, and she wants one, and he's like, but no, then you're taking away from me.
right.
Right? And
Exactly.
some of the conversation that I don't want to have is people coming in and being like, but then you're crowding straight people out of the story. There are so many opportunities for straight people to find indoctrination and support and validation in the stories that exist,
Mhm.
that queer people carving out, a percentage of the stories that are produced uh, to see themselves in isn't going to take anything away. You're still going to have plenty of ice cream. You're going to have more ice cream, more media than you can possibly consume in a lifetime. There are more games out there that you can see yourself in than I'm ever going to look at and see myself as a queer, pan romantic poly woman,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So we're not taking anything from anybody.
Yep. Um,
Um,
oh god, I had a
yeah, go
thought.
ahead.
It's fine. No, go, because my thought I had a thought and it just went there, so I'm sure it'll come back. Go for it. If you had something else you wanted
Yep.
to say.
So what I was going to say is the number one easiest, most straightforward way to center the stories of queer people in your game design is to include queer people.
Yep. Yeah.
That sounds really flip and snarky, but it's true.
No, it's very true, and one of the things that I truly cherish when we work on Scion, is the number of queer and trans people that I work with, right? It's very easy for us to, put us in when we're there. Like, I think that it was, MJ Rodriguez, but I know it was someone who was involved with Pose, who said that if you are not at the table, you're on the menu. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. If we're not included, then there's not really a good way to know if you're doing it right. And if you're going to be telling our stories, look, I'm glad when cishet people tell our stories and include us, but like include us and pay us because you're going to be
Yep.
making money off of us, right? Like if you're writing something that you're going to be getting paid for and you're making money off of our stories, then bring us in from the ground up. Not only will you get a better story, but like you're not going to be profiting off of someone else's lived experience without including them
Right.
and compensating. So,
Absolutely. Um, this includes using language that is inclusive. If you are
yep.
writing a storyline where, for example, if you're writing a LARP or you're writing a supplement,
Mhm.
think about including language like pregnant person rather than woman, or parent rather than mother.
Yep.
Stop and think about the fact that the language that you are using signals to your audience and sets a tone, and in many many ways, and I have to tip my hat to Jonathan Lavallee, who was the first person to challenge me on this, by making sure that your pronouns are diverse, that the characters you writing are diverse, that you are not shutting the door on people exploring their own fruitful void
Yep.
with the language that you choose. You are specifically and explicitly inviting people to consider non hetero, non normative dynamics.
Yep. One thing that I would also bring up and put on the table that I actually think Blue Rose from Green Ronin does really well is challenging, especially in fantasy games and sci fi games, challenging the assumption of inbuilt homophobia and transphobia. Um,
Hmm.
a lot of times, especially, okay, Davos, you need to get off my chair. Um, sorry, my dog. Um, a lot of times what we see, especially in fantasy worlds, is that people approach it from the assumption that to be realistic, the world has to be overtly homophobic or transphobic, or that polyamorous relationships cannot be just an accepted and normal part of society, and more even than that, that they must, if they are accepted, have been recently accepted, that the history of this fantasy world must somehow track with people's modern perception of the queer rights movement, right? Um, and not only is this kind of anti-escapism for queer folks, because like I really
We
I
already deal with that shit.
deal with this. Like I don't want to go to a fantasy world and have to rehash the things that I live with every single day, right? But it also plays into the like that myth of the linear progression where history was always worse than now is. We never
Mhm.
got worse at anything. We've only ever gotten better. And you aren't going to tell a complicated, interesting story if you are buying into some really basic um, story fallacies. So let's
Mhm.
like look at the very basis for what you're putting into your world. Are you from the get go assuming that your people have to be othered, right?
Right.
Um, and some of the things that I've worked with game designers on where this is concerned is the concept of, for example, why does your if your world includes a magical HRT or a magical, body aligned to gender potion, right? Why is it hard to get? Why is it expensive?
Right.
Why does it
Yep.
cost anything at all? One of the changes that Hiromi just made for Scion that I really love is that it is an inbuilt power for all Scions. As soon as they get their visitation, they can change their bodies, however they want to. They can configure them. There was some pushback on that where people are saying, well, what about, is that you can use it for disguise, whatever. And Hiromi's like, can you just stop? Like don't even entertain the question. You don't have to entertain that question at that point if someone starts devil's advocating. But like, why is it expensive? Why is it hard to get? Why are you putting that behind a gate the way that we deal with in the real world? And I would say that you can even put it on to the players, right? where
Hmm.
you build it so it's easy, and you can even sidebar it and say, you know what, if you want to tell a story that centers a struggle to understand and find and know oneself, because that is one of the classic stories, right? Then you can
Yep.
change that at your table. You can make this more difficult at your table with the consent of all parties. Um, but we're going to say that it can be as easy as you want it to be.
Right.
And you can make the decision to make it more difficult if you want to.
Right.
But I don't see the point in, especially in fantasy settings and sci-fi settings, anything that isn't quote unquote real world, right?
Yep.
Baking in the homophobia and transphobia. And I would even challenge people to look at ways that they can do alt present and alt history where that just isn't the case. Like if you're alting the history so that some big event didn't happen or did happen, why can't you just make it not suck to be queer? Why?
Right.
Please give me
About
the reason, right? And I don't think there is one. So
we're
yeah.
about 50 minutes in. We do have a question from chat, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay.
So we
Yep.
have asking for a specific, like I guess your own definition of what is the difference between including queer content, such as writing characters who are queer or bringing in a queer relationship, versus centering it as a core of design. Like explicitly, what is the difference between those two forms?
Do you want to go?
Sure. Um, I think that there are two branches of conversation that we are having, and they're entwined and they're connected. One is normalizing and demystifying and making it a part of your world, and making it just right by using the phrase pregnant person rather than pregnant woman. You introduce the possibility that a trans man is carrying the child in your storyline. And so there is the we exist and we have not been erased out by cisist straight heteronormative language. And then there is the are we actually I guess there's three threads. Then there's the our stories are central to the plot lines and the things that people are excited about. Is this a world where supplements feature queer families? Is this a situation where it's a story game that has consciously, deliberately included these elements? And then there's the what have you done deliberately to your mechanics or to how your game is manifest that queers the game?
Mhm.
Um, do you kind of agree, Spider, with those three
I do.
examples?
Yeah, I really
Okay.
do. And I'm gonna actually hop over real quick. I actually have some notes over here about because I want to provide a quick definition here. I want to give a shout out to Rachel who actually put this in the Ray Cole who put this in our notes for our panel later today. To what does it mean when you use to queer something as a verb? That comes from queer theory from the late 80s and the 90s. Queering is something that we do as opposed to something that we are. It is an action of uh, pulling back the expectations of society as regards, specifically as regards sexuality and gender, but it kind of expands from there because then you start queering family forms and queering stuff requires queering legal because what does it mean to own something as a polyamorous unit and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
just I wanted to kind of sidebar real quick, what are we talking about when we say we're queering something? It's not just like I am queer therefore what I do queers things. It is a deliberate intentional act of pulling back the assumptions that we have made and
Yep.
challenging those and trying to move forward with an intentional queer society and an intentional queer life.
Mhm.
So with that being said, I think that the big difference, I think, right, between just inserting something and my kind of my queer is pasted on yay and centering queer stories begins and ends with intention and intentional design. Because if we're talking about querying something, right, that's an intentional design. You are intentionally questioning
Yep.
why you have this assumption in place, right?
Right.
So when you are sitting down to design your next amazing game that we're all going to play next year, right? You are sitting down with a design document and saying, okay, what are the assumptions that I have made that may decenter queer people and their stories? And how can I change them, remove them, more pull them in, more pull those stories in toward the center. So it's not just I put a trans man in one story, or there is a canonical family in one of my supplements. It's how does that family get included, and how can people pick up that family and play it,
Yep.
um and what's my intention. It really begins at the most foundational levels and the concepts of what you're bringing as a game.
Mhm. Um, One of my favorite examples and a project that I was closely involved with, and I got to see this process happen. I saw the moment when the game got queered. And it was during a playtest, and it was so profound. I get goosebumps talking about it now because it fundamentally changed gameplay. So, Laura Simpson is the designer of Companion's Tale. It is a
Okay.
game, it's a story game in which you are telling the story of everybody except the hero, which already on some level is defiant and subversive, right? It's so good. And you get companion roles and you get face cards.
Okay.
And early in the first couple of play tests, you got face up face cards to match. You picked a face card and a companion. And what ended up happening is that we had the first couple of sessions I played had very sort of Disneyfied things where the pretty person was the lover, and where family units were very two parents and one child and very sort of traditional, right?
Right.
And at some point, Laura just like, I watched a little circuit fried in her head and she flipped over the face cards. And she's like, no, you get what you get. And so all of a sudden,
And
and at the time we were playing with the face card deck from Pathfinder. It was the Pathfinder face
right,
deck
right,
before she did her art direction, before she had the
right,
beautiful artwork from the game. And all of a sudden we were telling tales where the lover was older, was a crone, and everybody else, right? And so there were cross-generational love stories, and there were queer families, and there were polyamorous families, and there were families where we discovered along the way that the hero was actually the beast in the game, the beast
right,
archetype, and
right.
everybody else was supporting this character that was outside of the norm. And it was just it was transformative to the game. And I choke up because the first time we realized that we were telling a queer, like,
Oh,
multi-parent,
yeah.
multi-adult household story, we just stopped and went, oh, that is transgressive, because it broke down your expectations. And it's Lucas had said, I love when the mechanics of a system directly support and bring someone into the mentality of a theme, often without the players realizing it.
Yeah.
And the elegance of that design decision by Laura brings everybody to the table to these queer stories, and it's a non-issue.
Yeah.
Nobody I've ever seen. Now, I've had someone rage quit because there were battle ducks, and that was too weird. You did not ride ducks into battle. But the polyamorous family that had children spread across the continent and co-parented nomadically,
Right,
nobody gave a shit.
right. I love it.
And it was
That's
just,
just incredible.
yeah.
It actually reminds me of one of my favorite conversations that I've had. Um, I wrote an adventure and a short story for Blue Rose, both of which are in 2020 publishing hell, and maybe someday will actually see the light of day. But when I was working on the short story, I specifically um, wanted to center a trans man in the story. And as I was reading through the books and talking with people about it, I realized that the people who had designed Blue Rose had done a wonderful job by including the word, a diegetic word for transgender, right? Anybody who transes their gender in any way, there is an in-universe word for that. They also have, canonical polyamorous marriages and all kinds of things like that. But one thing that they noticed that they did not have was a diegetic word for cisgender.
Oh.
And I said, hey, I want to point this out. Would you be open to me in this story creating and establishing a in-universe word for cisgender? Because if you only have a word for transgender, if you only have a way to specify that is another form, it was an unintentional woke othering is I guess the way that I want to put it.
Yep.
I believe that the full intention was wonderful inclusion. Okay.
Yep.
I do not believe anyone had any intentions to do anything other than bring trans people in, and I believe there were trans people involved in that decision. But when I looked at that, I was like, but why isn't there a word for this, right? So there's a way that you can improve it, right? And to everyone's wonderful credit, and I definitely don't want to downplay or say anything negative about this whole process. When I brought that to Joe Carricker, I said, hey, what do you think about this? And he said, let me talk to the people who actually worked on it, and came back 2 days later, in the email time, and said, yeah, let's do it. Go ahead, create it, put it in the story. So we did. And I think it is both an example of how you can have your best intentions and miss something, and how
Yep.
you could, continually queer your canon, um, and how even, queer people can sometimes miss something that may not necessarily be in their lane. Because Joe is a gay man, but he's cis, right? And so it would not necessarily have occurred to him, and didn't, right, to have that happen. And when it was brought, he said, yes, let's do it. Let's move forward. So I think that as we work to center queer stories, we have to come to it with a mind that there's always somewhere better that we can be. And we can always, we will miss things, and we can always do more. So when you put your best effort out there in the world, I'm not saying you have to give credence or time to the people who are not coming to you in good faith, but know that there's going to be a time that your good faith efforts are going to miss something, and that you will
Well,
have an
and
opportunity
progress is a
to,
moving barrier.
and you will have an opportunity to progress.
Yeah.
Um, One thing that I always say is that I am looking forward to the day when my radical ideas are outdated and cliche and trite. I am so excited for the day that someone says, okay, grandpa, but how we say it now is this. I will be ecstatic, because that will
Yep.
mean that the conversation continues to move on, and that when I shuffle off this mortal coil, I can, hand off the torch to another generation, probably well before I shuffle off. But you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yep.
so it has to be a continuous conversation. It was a very long way of saying that it has to be a continuous conversation. And I challenge people to be excited when the things that they have worked on become outdated, because that means that there's an opportunity to do something even cooler.
Well, stop
We're
and think
about.
about how
Oh, sorry.
revolutionary when we were teenagers, when we were early 20 something, when Vampire the Masquerade came out and there was queerness in the images and in the
Yeah.
subtext. We were like, whoa, 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 back up this bus. What?
Yep.
And there was an entire generation of queer nerds that went,
Yep.
oh, and something in us
Yep.
relaxed. And
Yep.
now we look back at Vampire and go, oh, holy fuck. There's some
I
things that we need to catch up on.
I sobbed hysterically at the Verbena trad book when it first came out, because it included a young gay man who was HIV positive, and his mentor, he's like, don't you understand that, like, I'm trashed and I'm ruined, like I'm gonna die soon, like I have AIDS. And his mentor said, oh God, I'm gonna cry. Yes, but you don't have to. Like, and to hear that in like 93 or 94, I'm gonna cry. But like to hear that in it was so revolutionary. And like so much of the media that we regarded as so revolutionary has become problematic or trite. Like I get blown away by people who say that like Sandman is transphobic. I'm like, are you kidding me? That's the first time I saw a trans woman, validated by by a force of the universe, right? Like there are transphobes in the text, but like death validates the trans woman that she is a woman, and that was the first time I'd ever seen that. So I think those are my good examples of things that were revolutionary at their time, and then
Yeah.
now they are problematic. And I think when our work becomes problematic because the conversation has moved on, it is not an attack, it is an opportunity to renew and refresh and redirect and learn more and do better things. So I think
I, y-
somebody was interjecting with a question. Sorry.
Yep, it was just
Lucas,
saying
were you
about
interrupting?
it was just about a 30-minute check, but also there's a thought in the comments, but if you're continuing here, I can wait till this conversation's done.
Oh, I was just gonna say that I kind of feel the same way about. So my household laughs at me because I am the one person who had read tons and tons and tons of sci-fi before and fantasy before I tried reading Tolkien. And I got to Tolkien and I threw the fucking Hobbit across the room. I'm just like, what is this? Because people took what he did
Right.
and looked at it and went, oh, I can go one step better.
Yep.
And we are seeing the same thing where there were groundbreakers, where people broke the ice, and now we're going one step better, right? The belonging outside belonging genre, right, is an evolution of Monster Hearts, is an evolution of Apocalypse World, right? And so you can trace the DNA, but you can see where each iteration, the design is getting more and more, moves as our understanding and as our language moves.
Right. And I am actually gonna to put that forward as a challenge too, because one of the conversations that I see in discussing queer media is that the media of even a couple of years ago is somehow lacking, right? Like the conversation I remember seeing was about Owl House and Steven Universe, that Steven Universe wasn't as good and had failed somehow because Owl House is better. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Steven Universe walked so Owl House could run, right? Like, and
Right.
all of each, it has to
Yep.
be iterative and progressive. But as we look back, I also challenge us to not say that this was a failure, because it is not where we are now, right? And that in and of itself is a queering of expectations, right? Because you cannot expect yourself to have always been where you are now. If that is the case, then you have not gone
Mhm.
anywhere. So as we look back, we can look for opportunities. I prefer generally not to look for opportunities for shame, but to say, like, to if you look back, you look at it as a goalpost and a marker. And also I think for this is maybe a little plea, because like I am an older gamer, right? And as you just saw, like I will cry over things that happened in 1994 because it meant so much to me. And as
Yeah.
gaming both ages and new blood comes in, right? There's going to be those of us who were gaming in the 80s and the 90s and things like that. And there are going to be things that were incredibly important to us um, that are no longer where the conversation is at. That doesn't mean that those things were bad in and of their time. And if you respect those things now, Abe Simpson, it will happen to you too. Like you will not know what it is anymore, and you're not going to be with it at some point. And if you give that grace, then the generational knowledge will pass more easily. I guess is where I'm going.
Yep. So, in prepping for this panel, I was thinking through game experiences that have been defiant, that have been radical, that have challenged cultural or social norms. And I was kind of cataloging the experience because I have played a lot of game experiences that either we queered in the moment or were intrinsically queer in their design. And all of a sudden, I had this lightning bolt moment where I realized that there was a game I played. It's Little Pet Shop of Horrors. It's one of the LARPs from the Intercon community, where I didn't think about it at the time, but my character was a metaphor for a disabled, queer, possibly trans person. And she was a bird. She was a lovebird. So I was stuck. They taped me out a 4 foot by 4 foot space on the floor. I was not permitted to leave my cage. And I ended up in a love triangle where there was a bird, and I ended up in love with a cat. And I played this game and I played this role, and it was some of the best role play I've ever had with a group of strangers in my life. It was intense because I had to get people to go out and bring me information. And
Right.
I became an information broker because everybody knew where to find me. And I had this intense love triangle going on where there was the expected love who was like, "But why don't you love me enough to be with me?" And then the cat. And at the end, I got a magic potion from this dark elder god who
And I
gave
love
me a boon to become a cat. And I had this moment where I'm standing in my cage and I'm like, holy crap, I'm about to leave my cage behind. I'm about to leave behind everything. And fuck, if it wasn't it, honestly, let me think. 2005. 2005. And today, standing in my kitchen, I went, that was a queer trans story. I played a queer trans bird cat.
Yeah.
So sometimes you get there and you get those experiences, and then afterwards you're like, oh no, like I was defiant and I was rebellious and I was joyful, and my story got a happy fucking ending. And that was the most rebellious part of the entire story, is that my bird did not die, did not get tortured, was not disowned by her community or her family. So sometimes the queer game design is letting those characters and those people have happy stories.
Say, like, you actually hit on something that is a conversation that I've been having uh in the queer community as a whole, which is I'm gonna quickly define some things for folks who may be watching and are not aware of these conversations. There is kind of a split in the trans community between people who call themselves trans medicalists, and people who are not trans medicalists. Basically, there are other terms for them, but I don't care for them. Trans medicalists have a very strict definition of what it means to be trans. A lot of them are not accepting of fluid or non-binary identities. Some are, but they believe that you have to have dysphoria to be transgender, that you have to transition medically to be transgender, that your medical transition has to include certain elements. And a lot of the trans medicalist philosophy comes from Harry Benjamin and comes from, and who you can Google on your own time. I'm not going to talk about him today. Um, and his very narrow and harmful definitions of transness, right? And a lot of the trans medicalist philosophy is a reaction to um, being gate kept by cis people, right? And it is a perpetuation of cisgender gatekeeping. You must be this trans to change your name, to access therapy, to get the surgery that you want, or whatever, right? You have to be this trans enough to be legitimate. But the problem with accepting that definition of transness, um, other than the fact that it wasn't created by us, right, is that it centers the idea of transness on an idea of pain. It means that to be transgender is to experience your gender as pain. And I just think that's bullshit. And I absolutely deny. I'm not going to do that, right? To need to have dysphoria to be transgender means that I cannot define myself by my joy. I must define myself by my pain. And I not only refuse that for myself, but I refuse that for the people who come after me. Um, it is to me
Yep.
a mindset that I analogize it as boomers saying, well, I paid off my student loans, so you shouldn't get student loan relief, right? Like, why don't you want things to be
Right.
better for the people that follow you? And so the challenge in centering queer stories is not just centering queer stories, right? Because a lot of our stories are painful, but making a deliberate and marked effort to center queer joy. We can tell painful stories. That is, we have a right to the richness of human experience, which includes all of its joy and pain. But to this point, because of things like the Hays Code, because of this transmedicalist philosophy, all of that, right? It is our pain that has been centered because the only way that we're allowed to be queer, to be trans, right, is if it is just too painful for us to be cishet. And that is a definition that we desperately need to defy when we are creating our stories. I'm a little passionate about this idea, so
Well, and I'm just going to interject a little snarkiness here, which is that I know quite a few cis people whose gender is suffering and it has been inflicted on them, whether or not it brings them joy. And so let's just
that's
put a
that's
pin in that. And that
yeah, yeah, that's fantastic.
that is a whole panel unto itself. But I just like, as a counterpoint to the transness has to involve suffering,
Oh, yeah.
let's just
I
throw that out.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that, centering those stories means centering pain, is one that is a central thing of queering, right? Whatever queerness you bring into the center, you have to make room for that joy and for the full richness of experience, right? The pendulum can then also swing the other way, right? Where there's almost like a woobification of queerness, where if the story does not end up 100% pure light sugar, right? Then it is bad representation somehow. And you don't owe anyone outside of yourself when you're telling a story, like when you're playing a game, you don't owe anyone good representation. I think in a course of design, we owe
Right.
people the opportunity to create the kind of representation that they would like to see at their table. So you
Right.
don't owe someone a saccharinification of queerness either, and don't do that
Right.
because you end up hobbling the stories that people can tell and the way that they can talk about themselves, right? My experience of my transness came explicitly from gaming. I figured out I was trans because I started playing characters that could rearrange their bodies any way they want. And someone leaned over to me at one point and said, "Do you think maybe that little fox might mean that you are not a woman? Do you think that maybe because you've been playing them for like a decade, you might want to look at that?" And I was like, "What are you talking about?" So we have to give people that space, right? So they can tell their own. I know, right? So they can tell their own stories and open up that space for themselves. But that means you have to give space to
Yep.
the whole breadth of who we can be. I did see there was a question, and I don't want to completely blow past because I see that we're at like almost 45 minutes. So I want to make sure that we touch on that.
Yep.
So there was one specific question asking about Blue Rose and if there was ace and arrow people with diegetic language.
I do not remember it off the top of my head, but I do want to stress that Green Ronin has kind of been in publishing pause hell for 2 years. So that may exist somewhere in that valley between, you know, writing and publication. And I also don't want to say definitively that it does not exist because all I can say is that I don't remember, but I haven't written on any Blue Rose stuff for 2 years. I've mostly been writing for Onyx Path for the last couple of years. That would be an amazing thing to float to Joe Carricker, um, who is the line developer for Blue Rose and is an absolutely fantastic person and very, very lovely to work with. So I would say I don't know, and I would encourage that to maybe be brought to him. as something that he can either say, well, yeah, that's in this supplement that isn't coming, hasn't come out yet, or let's talk about how we can put that in, because I'm fairly certain that would be his response, because he's totally awesome.
There's also been some discussion. There's one person who's working on a neurodivergent queer magical girl TTRPG, and about, for them, the parallels between queer experience and coming out of the closet as the queer experience of coming out of the closet and the autistic experience of taking off the mask or unmasking, and how you talked before about the playing both a trans and a disabled character, the ways that normalization and representation can work for queer, disabled, neurodivergent stories, and the relation between these for you.
Oh, first of
Spider,
all,
do you want to go first there?
my God, I want to play that game so much. Do I want to play that game? That sounds amazing. I'm so excited about it. There is such a parallel there, and I think for a lot of us too, those ideas are so intertwined. Um, because part of knowing myself, like peeling back femme, was a mask I wore, right? Like that was part of my coded, like, I'm going to be the neurotypical woman that you want, right? Mom and dad, I'm going to do this. And this is what, and I put that mask on and I put on
It's called performative femininity for a reason.
Exactly, exactly. So I think that, like, I'm so excited about that idea being explicit in the text, because it is implicit in the experiences that we have. Yes, I love it. Beautiful. Um,
Yeah.
God, I'll just sit here and say yes because I love it.
Darla, whose last name I don't remember, is the designer that showed up to Tea with Avi the other day, who has a game called Dear Great Cthulhu, Please Stop Giving Me Superpowers. And the title itself is the elevator pitch for the queerness and the mental health and the transness. Like, it's all baked in, and it's like all these things intersect, and we all have these amazing superpowers of cope and resilience and stubbornness and defiance and radicalness, because we've got all these stupid stacked up superpowers. And I think there is a lot of intersection. I think that my ADHD diagnosis, which did not come until I was in my 40s, was as very, oh, well, duh, as my queerness. And I actually knew I was polyamorous before I knew I was queer by a whole 12 years. I married both of my best friends on the playground on the same day in kindergarten because I didn't want anyone to feel left out. And right?
Everything I have ever heard. Like, you're just gonna put that on your headstone. I married my best friends on the kinder. Sorry. That's amazing. If I needed a 5-second story to sum you up as a
But then I got the diagnosis of ADHD and I went, oh, duh.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the first time I told myself that I was a lesbian after I learned that the term lesbian existed was when I was 8. And then I had to go and, like, hide, right? Because I grew up in a very rural area and I had to conceal who I was. And I was also the weird kid, of course, because I'm autistic and I have ADHD, and I was the weird kid in class in a rural area. And so you learn to do this, right? And to hide and to defend, because it really is a defensive gesture, right? And as you start peeling those pieces away to become the you who you are, um yeah, I mean, it's incredibly similar, and in a lot of ways it's just as much of an, oh my god, yes, of course, of course. I mean, because, like, Kat was diagnosed as ADHD 15 years before me. 15 years my kid was diagnosed, and I never went, oh yeah, maybe that's me too, and Kat was diagnosed as autistic before me. So it took me seeing it in someone outside of myself and having it laid out to be able to see it. And I think that's, to kind of circle back, part of the power of the stories that we're telling here is that, like, you know when we show this reality, um people will begin to see themselves in it. There are a lot of stories of queer kids, especially like ace and arrow kids, um explaining their ace selves to their parents and their parents being like, "Wait, that's a thing I can be?" Like, or non-binary is like, "Wait, I've always felt that I didn't quite fit, you know?" Like, I
Oh, if you want to hit a room full of dudes of an age with a lightning bolt, get like 5 of differing in the same room and say, "Okay, imagine that when you were 13 or 10, instead of taking a bar bat mitzvah or instead of taking first communion, you got handed a list that was all of the traditionally feminine uh traits in our culture. And you
right,
got to go through and say, that one, but not that one. Yes, this one, but not this one. And
yep,
and no one explained it to you. You just got a list and you were like, I like that. I don't like that. Not that. Yes, this. And then when you handed the sheet back, you then got masculine coded traits. And you went through and was like, oh, not that one. Yes,
right,
this one. Ooh,
right,
I like that one. And then at the end, they collate it and hand you back a character sheet that
yep,
says, these are the things that you've opted into, but you can cross things out or add them to this list at any given time. And
yep,
for me, this works when there's a conversation about non binary identities where I'm getting I just don't get it, or I don't understand, or this is just, I'm too old for this. And
yep,
I give them this metaphor,
that's
and
amazing.
there's always one who just freezes
Yep.
and goes, ah, shit.
Yeah, there's always one. There's always one egg, that's out there, or someone who just now gets it, but I have there are a lot of eggs out there that they don't maybe realize that they're eggs. And I think that is kind of the power of these stories that we tell. I would have given almost anything when I was 15 to have some of the stories and to have some of the I tell you, like, kids online, I'm like, look, I would have literally given my eye teeth to have the community that you all have now, and to have the opportunity to talk about my gender and my sexuality, and, like, make up your own genders. I don't care. That's amazing. I wish I'd had that, right? Like, if you want to be star gender or nebula gender or, hokey pokey gender, I don't care. Like, that's wonderful. Do your thing, man. Because I wish I'd had it. And I think that we have the opportunity to create that space for other people. And if we keep in mind and keep that kind of like right here when we're designing and writing, um, that we are being gifted with the opportunity to create that space for others. I think that you kind of can't really go wrong. You could maybe go more right, but you at that point, I don't think you can really go wrong. Do we have are there any other questions that anything that anybody wanted to ask? 'Cause we are like, I think we're like 2 minutes left.
Not at the moment, though. If you'd like to, both of you, reintroduce yourselves and where people can find your things just before we have to leave.
You can go first if okay. Would you want to go first or okay.
Sure. I'm Avonelle Wing with Double Exposure. You can find me at Avonelle on Twitter. You can also find me after this session over on the Double Exposure Discord. I think that I'm in a panel like in 2 minutes, but I will be over there afterwards if people want to connect with me for resources. And I run DexCon, Dreamation, Metatopia. If you have not had the joy of a community that embraces queerness in person and a gaming community where people are empowered to say, we don't do that here, or yes, more of that, we do that here, please come join us. Spider,
Absolutely.
your turn.
I am Spider B Perry. And you can find me literally everywhere except Instagram under somebody else got VA Spider on Instagram. It's VA Spider, V as in Victor, IA as in Apple, and then Spider like the animal. That includes my Patreon, TikTok, all of it. And you can find my writing all over the internet, mostly in Onyx Path books these days. And again, I am also the co-owner of Nerdy Kepi. We are happily, once again, a sponsor of Metatopia, and I think actually our ad is up next to it right now.
Yep.
So right now through the end of November, we are running free domestic shipping on orders $50 plus. With the code META21. And if you can't remember nerdykepi.com, you can always find us at ithaspockets.gay.
All right, my loves, I'm gonna jet because I have somewhere to be, but you know where to find us if you need love.
Yep, and you can find me at, was it 4 o'clock? Yeah, 4 o'clock for Queering the Canon, and I please do come join us because I think it's gonna be a great conversation.